Whitehead Railway Museum presents The Railway Ghost of Ballymacarrett, adapted from the Belfast Ghost Guide and read by Ian Sinclair.
The 7:30 train to Bangor had just passed when I stepped out of the signal box at Ballymacarrett Junction into the dense fog that dreadful November evening. My shift for the day had ended, and I was glad to be heading home, but not before stopping for a few bottles of stout at the pub. I had just climbed down onto the track to make my way back to the station, with a lantern before me, although that made little difference in that terrible fog, when I heard someone not far behind me. A shiver went up my back. Who on earth could be coming down the tracks on such a night as this? I stopped and waited, and eventually I could make out the figure of a woman approaching me through the fog. She was a young woman, and as she got nearer she greeted me. "Thank God you waited on me. It's a terrible night. You can hardly see 2 feet in front of you." The two of us then headed back to the station together. On the way, she explained that she was taking a shortcut to the city centre, where she was going to meet her cousin. When we eventually reached the station, I led her through and bade her good night before I signed out and headed into Station Street. All of a sudden a creepy feeling came over me. The fog was still as thick as it had been earlier, and there were very few people wandering around the streets, not that you could have seen them anyway. There was hardly any traffic, and as I walked towards Memel Street I could hear the kids playing Rally-O. I could barely make out the flickering gas lights as I headed towards the Aero Bar and Bridge End, and as I walked I kept feeling that something was very wrong. My mind became tormented by the tales of ghosts at the Lagan, or the strange stories about the banshees on the yard wall which my granny used to tell me about. As I walked towards the pub, I tried to convince myself that there was no such thing. After all, I was a full-grown man, but even so, I couldn't dispel my misapprehensions about such beliefs. Soon I could hear the singing as the lights of the pub became clearer and clearer. I went through the doors and straight up to the bar. A couple of my Railway colleagues were already there, so I got a bottle of stout and joined them. As we got talking, I told them of the woman I'd met on the tracks that night. "Who was she?" one of them asked. "She said her name was Harvey or something like that." I couldn't remember her first name, so I described what she looked like. Thin build, straight red hair, and in her 20s. Suddenly, someone interrupted. "Are you sure her name was Harvey?" The elderly man then told us about an incident which took place in that area in 1896. He said that in February of that year, a local man who was returning from his post on the night shift made a ghastly discovery on the Hollywood branch of the County Down Railway, adjacent to the Ballymacarrett Junction signal cabin. As he was walking down the line, he stumbled upon the mutilated remains of a woman lying scattered over the rails at the junction, where the Hollywood line separates from the main line. The newspapers recorded the spectacle as being sickening in the extreme. The body was lying between the lines, completely severed in two, and portions of it were scattered for a distance of 50 yards, the place all around being saturated with blood. Sergeant Goff from Mount Pottinger Road Barracks was one of the first on the scene. Under his direction, the pieces of the body were gathered up and removed to the morgue. Later that day, the body was identified as that of Catherine Hanvey. She was a single woman of around 30 years of age who had worked as a domestic servant in a house on the Lisburn Road. She had been living with her sister at Montrose Street when she left to visit some friends in Hollywood. When her body was discovered, a punched third-class railway ticket from Belfast to Hollywood was found in her pocket, indicating that she had been on board the train. The date was also printed on the ticket, and the cause of that evening's sad events gradually became clearer. Through one way or another she had fallen from the carriage of the train, and as her body lay in the tracks it had been passed over and knocked about by several different trains. Subsequent inquest evidence tried to ascertain whether she had been of unsound mind, and whether she fell from the train by accident, or did she jump in and attempt suicide. To this day we do not know for sure, but the verdict stated that the said Catherine Hanvey on the 21st of February 1896 on the Hollywood and Bangor branch of the Belfast and County Down Railway, opposite Central Street, Ballymacarrett in the city of Belfast, came to her death from injuries received, caused by an engine and train passing over her. After hearing this tale and dismissing it as nonsense, I finished my stout, said goodnight to the company and left for home. As I stepped out of the pub, I took out my pocket watch to see how late it was. It had stopped at 7:30 p.m.
The Railway Ghost of Ballymacarrett was adapted from the Belfast Ghost Guide by kind permission of the Belfast History Project and produced by Ian Sinclair for Whitehead Railway Museum.